Well, hello, my friends, and happy Sunday, and welcome to this week's edition of My Journey with Jesus, and a happy Thanksgiving to all. It has been a great week, and I am so glad to be back on the channel sharing my thoughts in this week's devotional video. My name is Dave Little, and I am so pleased that you have come to join me here for this week's episode. We have been studying the names of God, and in our most recent edition, we are going to look at another of the names of God, the name Jehovah Mekoddishkem. It took me all week to learn how to pronounce that as we continue on in the study of the names of God with a discussion of Jehovah Mekoddishkem, the God who sanctifies. Today's discussion begins in the book of Leviticus. And if I had to guess, I would surmise that most of us have never done a deep dive or a detailed analysis of Leviticus. In fact, Leviticus gets kind of a bad rap. Oftentimes, when somebody makes a vow to read the whole Bible from start to finish over the course of a year, they'll enjoy Genesis and Exodus with the action and the cool plot lines, and then they get to Leviticus and they get bogged down and they lose interest. Leviticus is the book that I call Where New Year's Resolutions Go to Die. Don't worry, I'm not going to go off on a sidebar and spend the next 27 weeks of my journey with Jesus on a deep dive into the book of Leviticus, but there are some important principles in Leviticus that help us understand who God is and how he moves in our lives, and that will be the topic for today's discussion. When folks look at the book of Leviticus, mostly we see a bunch of do's and don'ts. God gives a lot of moral instructions to his people and a lot of practical knowledge in this book. There are dietary guidelines, there are principles of hygiene, there are guidelines for worship, and there's lots of annoying prohibitions about sex. Do this, don't do that, but there are good reasons for the existence of all these instructions, and there are underlying rationale for the importance of all of these instructions. The nation of Israel had just come out of slavery in Egypt, and they now found themselves intermingled with a lot of different nations and cultures, with a lot of different practices and traditions. God needed the nation of Israel to maintain its unique identity in the world and not get bogged down or diluted by the practices of these other nations. So God laid out a bunch of laws in the Old Testament, more than 600 of them, to ensure that Israel would maintain the racial and the spiritual purity that was necessary to give rise to the line of Christ. So the key principles of Leviticus can be summarized in a few points. Don't get mixed up in the pagan rituals of the societies around you. Israel was surrounded by nations that participated in idol worship and sexual pagan rituals and human sacrifice and all sorts of other things that God wanted his people, the nation of Israel, to be set apart from, to be unique, to be distinct from the rest of the world. Not only do we learn that we are to be set apart, but we also learn that sin is serious business. Sin demands a price. And the price of sin is what points us to the coming of Christ. And so all of the laws in Leviticus that are impossible to follow are really serving to point us to the problem of sin and the significance of sin and the cost of sin and the need for forgiveness and salvation through the coming of Christ. So from a historical perspective, Leviticus is very important to our understanding of God's work through history. And that brings us to the key verse of Leviticus and the point of today's discussion, which we find in Leviticus chapter 20. You shall consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my statutes and practice them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. I am Jehovah Mekoddishkem. Mekoddishkem is a big, long name that's hard to pronounce, and it can be hard to understand. We see Jehovah Mekoddishkem in one other place in the scripture in the book of Exodus. In this situation, God is instructing Israel about the importance of observing the Sabbath. Exodus 31, verses 12 and 13. But as for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, you shall surely observe my Sabbath. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. There's that word again, sanctify. God expects his people to be set apart, unique, distinct. Sanctification is another big, long word, almost as big and long as Mekoddishkem. And sanctification can be hard to understand, so we need to explore that in more detail. And we'll start diving into that today and continue with the sanctification principles next week. Sanctification is a process by which God sets his people apart and makes his people unique. We are set apart from sin and from the godless ways of the world, and we are set apart for God our Father, the Holy One, and for his purposes. So sanctification, being set apart, has the two dynamics: set apart from sin and set apart for service to God. In the case of the nation of Israel, the Israelites needed to be distinct from the surrounding pagan cultures in order for Jehovah to establish his unique nature, his attributes, and his character in the eyes of the world. This meant that his people could not be intermingled with the pagan nations and their idol worship and their other unholy practices. It also meant that Israel needed to be kept racially pure, not intermarrying with the pagans, in order to keep the line of Israel intact for the forthcoming birth of Jesus. In today's case, we as Christians are called upon to be separate from the world and dedicated to the purpose of God. We are to be his sacred ambassadors to the secular cultures in which we live. And like the Israelites before us, we are to be sanctified, set apart, unique, distinct. And Jehovah Mekoddishkem is the God who makes that happen. Now, when it comes to the stuff in the world, there are three kinds of stuff: common, profane, and sacred. Common stuff is common, regular, ordinary, everyday stuff that we come across in our environment that has no real moral or spiritual significance. I sit here at my desk and I'm surrounded by common stuff: pens, pieces of paper, a coffee cup, a backpack, whatever. On the other hand, the world is polluted with a number of things that would be considered profane, stuff that is defiled by evil. Things are not necessarily created profane, but things are defiled by evil. If I take this blank sheet of paper next to me and I draw a swastika on it, that would be profane. If I take my backpack and I load it up with heroin and go out and sell it on the street, that would defile my backpack and make my backpack an object of evil. In the case of the Israelites, they were surrounded by pagan cultures with all sorts of profane practices: idol worship, sexual immorality, and even human sacrifice was occurring in the pagan nations that surrounded Israel, and that is clearly not God's design for his people. In the same way, the things which are sacred are things that are special to God and reflect God's glory. The things that are sacred are considered precious because they are made to reflect the qualities of God. If I take this piece of paper next to me and write a love letter to my wife, that paper becomes precious. In the case of the Israelites, God ordained the Sabbath day to be kept holy and dedicated to worshiping him. It's just another day on the calendar until God sanctifies that day, and the Sabbath went from being a common day like all the others and became sacred before God. God's design for us is to live as creatures who are sacred, set apart from the common and from the profane in ways that bring glory to the name of our Creator. We have a special purpose in the world, not to be humdrum, common, everyday objects, and certainly not to profane ourselves with the evil in the world. As John wrote in 1 John chapter 2, verse 15, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. World there being the cosmos, as we've described it previously. So we are not to place our focus on the profane things of the world or even the common things of the world and become dedicated to those. But as Christians, we are the people of God. And the world is full of stuff and practices that are common with more than a few profane elements mixed in. But God's design for us is not to identify with the cosmos. If we love the world, if we love the cosmos, the love of the Father is not filling us and making us sacred. And we need to embrace the sacred identity for which God has created us. And so the question arises, how do we become the sacred people that God has called us to be? And the answer is to be sanctified, to be set apart from the world. And that can only happen through the power of Jehovah Mekoddishkem, the God who sanctifies. And next week we'll take a look at the entire process of sanctification and explore more about how that works. I am looking forward to completing that discussion as we look at the process of sanctification that begins when we're saved and continues throughout our life and throughout our walk with God, and is possible only through the power of God and the design of Jehovah Mekoddishkem, the God who sanctifies. So I look forward to picking up the discussion on that next week. This is where we will wrap things up for today. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's devotional video. It is a privilege and a joy to know and a blessing that people check out these videos on a weekly basis. And if you have questions or comments about this video, please feel free to leave your comments in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like. When you like this video, it doesn't do anything to promote my ego or I'm not looking to monetize my channel and make a killing off of doing this. This is just something that God has put on my heart to do with my YouTube channel. But when you give this video a like, it will promote this video in the YouTube search algorithms of other users so that other folks who may be surfing around on YouTube looking for imperfect videos made by imperfect followers of him, then this would be a video that would be promoted in those searches. If you want to hear more from the channel, you can hit the subscribe key down below and you will get notified whenever new content is posted to the channel. And until then, I look forward to picking up the discussion next week on how sanctification happens and how God works in our lives to set us apart for his purposes. And so until next week, thank you once again for tuning in. God bless you all, and go in peace.